Tim has been an active part of the service and support industry for over 15 years. Tim has been responsible for the education and certification business for the former STI Knowledge and was their business unit head for sourcing solutions for over 9 years. His leadership and insight positioned the company's sourcing solutions in the upper right-hand quadrant for Gartner's help desk outsourcing services 3 times this decade. He is now president and CEO of Be Virtual Inc., the leader in virtual workforce solutions for the service and support industry. Be Virtual provides customers the solutions they require to deliver a continuously high level of service and support remotely. And again, from what we know and from what we know in the industry, Tim has been regular on the various speaking circuits with specifically talking about this whole continuous movement of folks working remotely, whether in full-time roles or in some sort of a flex capacity in terms of being able to work off-site and work from home. So always interested in the trends and what's happening there. So without anything further, I'll introduce Tim Dewey.
Well, thank you, Rick. I appreciate it. Given our 30 minutes, I'll go ahead and jump right into our discussion for today, which is talking about the at-home agent and some of the training areas and areas to really focus on for those resources working remotely. And when we talk about at-home agents, we do broaden the conversation because we do have companies where resources may be developers, they may be level 2 resources, but in essence, they provide some type of support function to the organization, and they're working remotely. Recently, we've been working with companies who the management team is actually working remotely at times or traveling more than ever, and their team that's in brick and mortar actually is their remote team, even though they all come to work together in a single location. So as you think about the remote agent concept, really it's about how we're moving away from a traditional consolidated model to more of a distributed work environment. So as we go through today's presentation, if you keep that in mind, and if you have any questions related to it, and if you've got team members that may not be considered quote-unquote remote agents, certainly happy to answer any questions around that. But let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. So a couple of quick facts and figures that I've seen come across the wire here over the last couple of months that I thought I'd throw out there for consumption just to get started. And one of them was that 40% of U.S. employees are saying today that they could do their jobs from home. Kind of an interesting stat if you think about it. And if we all think about the core of support today and servicing customers, we are really adapted very well to be able to work from home. The technology advances are there, and more employees of companies, regardless of their role in the organization, can actually work from home with little or no barriers. So today we're going to focus on that and focus on the training around it. Another area to consider is that 2% of U.S. workers consider their home a full-time location as of today. Fairly low number, but I think as we start to see the baby boomers move out of the workforce and we start to see some of the millennials take over the workforce here in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to see that number grow fairly rapidly. As far as 61% of federal workers are eligible to work from home, yet only 5% do so today, there's an interesting change happening on the federal level within the U.S. government because President Obama signed into legislation back in January a telecommuting work act for all federal employees, which requires every federal agency in the U.S. to have to create a training program, have to create a program so that the employees within the federal government and the various agencies can work from home. So I think what we're going to see is those agencies who really understand the value of working from home for their employees, again, their federal employees, they're going to start to make that move here in the next 24 months. So we're going to see a rapid adoption at the federal level because, again, this teleworking act that was put in place basically provides the funding, the legislation, and the backing in order to make that change. The last point here is that 75% of the U.S. workforce will work outside of the office by 2013. And what this basically means is that 3/4 of the U.S. workforce does not have to go to the office to work. They can work out of, a Starbucks. They can work out of wherever. And obviously, we see that today. But if we think of it as just a major paradigm shift in the workforce today, we all have to look at it and say, you know what? The reality of me sitting in an office 5 days a week or my peers working in the office 5 days a week is not going to exist over the next decade, and I've really got to learn and understand what the skills are, not just for myself, but for my team, those that work within the organization, those that support customers, what are those skills and what is it that I need to ensure that there's training on for those resources? And so that's what we're going to focus on now.
Hey, Tim, I got a quick question just before you jump into that next slide.
Sure.
So, I mean, you've obviously come from a background with a significant workforce working in a large facility, I think, down in Georgia in your past. I'm not sure how many number of agents you had, but I think it was in the hundreds. And now you've gone to an operation which, again, you've moved to a virtual operation supporting a number of different corporations, and you've got obviously support agents all working from home. Can you talk to us just candidly about why you still feel that there is resistance to this model, and why, from your perspective, based on your experience, this works better for you and for your team versus where you came from before? So I guess I'm just trying to get my head around, what still is holding people back, and what are the typical answers that you get when people say, well, we can't have our agents working from home, and why has it been that much better for you, or has it been from a performance perspective?
Yeah, I mean, those are all great questions, and we could probably spend about 3 hours going through that one.
Exactly. Right.
But no, it's all great. It's all great. Ironically for me, we managed not only a center in rural Georgia, but we also managed a center in India and a couple of other locations. And the reality for us was, although we were centralized in those locations as a leader or a business unit leader working with resources, and for those companies who have offshore teams or have outsourced offshore, believe it or not, that's a remote team. And this is going back to 2004, 2005, when I looked at the models and said, where are we going at a macro level? And the reality is the service industry has been going in this direction for quite some time. We've masked it with consolidation in the earlier part of the decade between sort of 99 and 2005. We masked it with what we called consolidation. So we went from 6 centers to 3 or to 2. But now if you look at it, the reality is trying to communicate across centers is no different than trying to communicate one-to-one in a work-at-home model. The difference and the philosophical difference is why more and more companies haven't jumped on board at a faster rate is simply culture. Is simply understanding that we need to get our teams up to speed. We need to get them trained. And once they're trained and we all are on the same page as far as what that baseline training is, which we're talking about some of the concepts here today, that's where the comfort comes into play. A lot of the baby boomers who are quite honestly senior executives and run organizations today are simply saying, well, we're not ready to do that, or we don't want to do that, or we want to dip our toe in the water. And the reason is because they're not educated enough, they're not familiar with the models, they're not familiar with the technology that's available to them. And part of all of our jobs on the call is to really spend the time educating and bringing awareness to the fact that there is training out there, i.e. be virtual and the things that we do. But more importantly, there are tools, technologies, processes in play today in our service organizations that can allow us to work remotely. Ironically, in the businesses that we're in today, in service and support, we're the most adept and the most probably prone to be able to be successful working from home, simply because we measure things. And we're going to talk about some of those measurements in a minute. But the reality, Rick, is we are the most prepared to do it because we've already got a lot of the mechanics and technology in place today.
Fantastic.
So
and one more question. That was great. And just one last question that just come from a gentleman on the line right now is, what are the well, you might not know this, but are there any specific percentage statistics of remote working on the Canadian landscape? Do you have any? I mean, I imagine it's probably fairly similar to the U.S., but is there anything different that you've seen in Canada?
Yeah, it's almost the same. There's the same type of approach. The only difference is I've been unable to pull any sort of government data on at-home models and at-home work as far as how the government's approaching it. But certainly from a private perspective, from an organizational perspective, companies are moving along those lines.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. So the slide I have up here when we talk about day one skills, and anything you see in italics and sort of in apostrophes are concepts that we spend quite a bit of time on in our courses, so I thought I'd highlight them. But for us, in setting up remote models and the training we provide, it really begins with what we call mutual responsibility, and that's an understanding that you and your at-home agent has as far as what they're responsible for and what you're responsible. And a very quick example of mutual responsibility is, we all think traditionally when we started a new job, we come to the office, there's a desk, there's a chair, we get provided a computer. Our first day, someone brings us a cup of coffee, welcomes us to the team. Well, that whole dynamic has changed now when you're an at-home agent. And the reality is some of that responsibility no longer sits on the side of the employer, but sits on the side of the employee. For example, you're expected to have your workstation set up, right? You may be provided a computer from the company, but the reality is your responsibility is to ensure that it works and ensure that it's working within your home. And there's little things around those responsibility areas that become mutual, not exclusive to the employer. So we spend quite a bit of time talking about this. And on day one, you really want to set that expectation. We have a document for our employees that actually is a mutual responsibility document that outlines what they're responsible for working from home. So it's again, setting the stage for what is going to be the shared responsibilities of a work-at-home agent. Second item there is taking ownership of the work environment. That means what surrounds that at-home agent is their responsibility, ensuring that things like privacy are established, ensuring that your room isn't opened up to the rest of your family to walk in and start surfing on the web on your computer. It's about managing expectations. It's about ensuring that resource understands their responsibility working from home, and that requires maybe a different skill set for them. When a lot of, particularly at-home agents and their traditional skill set and what their expectations are, a lot of traditional call center support resources come to work and expect the company to do a lot for them. The reality is they're going to have to come to the table and do things themselves. And then the last item there is setting a routine for your employees. And this is important. On day one, you want to set the expectations about how you're going to communicate with them, about what their routine should be. Traditionally, if you have an employee who shows up 3 minutes before the start of their shift and sits down and logs in and jumps into the queue and gets ready to take calls right at the last minute, you may want to set the routine a bit different in working from home and being a bit more prepared and not maybe not as rushed. Now, ideally, they wouldn't be as rushed because their commute should be less than 10 seconds, but the reality is we all know that sometimes that employee segment is more about, hey, I'm going to show up 2 or 3 minutes before and then jump in the queue and get ready. So it's about establishing that routine, working from home, and what that's going to be.
And Tim, what's your experience with support organizations who don't establish baseline expectations and responsibility?
What you tend to get is an immediate lack of what I would consider to be a sense of urgency and a sense of consistency in the environment. Now, a lot of companies obviously are taking current employees and moving them to work from home, so they've established sort of what the routine is and what the expectations are. But when you're working from home, you are in essence and independent. I mean, you are working, the management style is different. You can still be managed working from home, but you are independent in that you do have to, for lack of better terms, manage yourself to some extent. And that reality and setting those expectations, if they're not done by the organization, you really risk that dilution of responsibility over time, and that disconnect starts almost on day one. And that's the last thing you want, is a disconnect between that resource working from home and the rest of the team, as well as the supervision in the organization. This next slide
Thank you.
about, sorry, Rick, about performance expectations, right? It's about setting the bar for remote agents. And this is, next to those day one expectations, this is probably the second area where a lot of companies are missing on today. A lot of companies believe that, well, if I send my employee to work from home and they're working in the office today, they can just take the same amount of calls or handle the same amount of incidents a day or follow up on the same number of emails. There is foundational proof in the marketplace today. You can do any Google search you want, that working from home creates a higher level of productivity. Therefore, if you're going to set up a team to work from home, your service level management associated with that team in theory and then application should be higher. And in order to do that, though, you have to set the bar on day one and say, here's how this team is going to perform. And unfortunately, I see way too many organizations just sending their team to work from home because they want to add it as a value add or a benefit, and not really trying to drive performance of the team. And it's really a failure that's going to hurt a lot of service organizations long term, because the idea behind remote models is not only the flexibility, not only the benefits to the employee, but also the benefits to the employer. And along those lines, you really want to look at things like comparative analysis. How do I see what I'm doing today, and how do I continuously improve over time? And we have a term that we use in both our training and within our organization called asset velocity. And that's simply managing the productivity of your team working remotely from the time they start there until the time they become extremely efficient. Now, if you're hiring from day one, you want to measure that from day one through day X. If you're taking someone who's working in brick and mortar and you're moving them home, look at their productivity. it should go up at least at a minimum 5 to 10%. We see in some organizations as high as 35% increase in productivity by working from home. And you say that that's a large number. It is a large number, but the reality is it exists in certain organizations. And even if you can drive a 10% goal number within your organization and explain that to your team before you send them home to work from home, or if you're hiring a new team, you've now increased your capacity by 10% in order to provide service and support in other places. So 10% is a fairly significant number, and most data coming back today is in that range at a minimum sometimes, and like I said, as high as 35% in some of the case studies I've seen.
And Tim, how many organizations today that you work with do you know that establish separate SLAs for home employees?
Unfortunately, I would say less than 5%, probably more along the lines of 2%. Actually segregate that group out, measure them differently and independently, and then combine the groups back. So ideally, over time, you'd combine the groups back if you've got a mixed, if you've got a blended model where you have some teams working from home and some working within brick and mortar. But the reality is number one, there should absolutely be that increase in productivity with the team working from home. If you don't break out those numbers, though, you won't identify that, and that's part of marketing the success of an at-home model. You know, I mentioned earlier we were talking about some of the barriers and challenges, and the reality is part of the responsibility is if you have an at-home model is marketing its success, not just to market your own success and the value of the program, but also to move that across the organization and find other productivity pockets possibly that other departments could adopt and follow. So imagine if you can take what you've done in maybe a small group of 3 to 5 resources and increase their productivity by 10%. Taking that business case back to the rest of the organization as a leader and saying, hey, this is what we've done with our group. Look what we can do for the rest of your organization or your departments by having your teams work from home. You know, your best team, the reality is what we see in a lot of organizations today is that those that are superstars are the ones that are being permitted to work from home first. So those making the transition from brick and mortar to work at home, they're really looking for the best team and looking for the ones that are high performers. The reality, though, is you should take a step back and create a skills profile for the at-home agent and what it's going to be. And the reality is a lot of people say, well, why should I create one? It's just another sort of job description. It's really not. The skills necessary to work from home are those that we define in our course, but you can also define them by going online, doing research, etc. The reality is that you need to have a skills profile for those resources working at home because at some point you are going to hire you know, straight from scratch and not necessarily pull off of a brick and mortar team, and you've really got to have a skills profile in place. And some of those essential skills are things like working habits. I just mentioned showing up 2 minutes before work in a rush and sitting down and logging into the queue just to make sure that you're there on time. It's little things like that that you've got to have resources that are far more dependable, that are ready to go 5 minutes before their shift. And excuse me, you may ask yourself, well, why does that mean anything? Well, let's say 5 minutes before their shift they're having a problem with their technology. The reality is working from home, they're going to have to troubleshoot and resolve that issue versus in the office where they may turn to someone and say, hey, I'm having a problem, get connected to the network. So it's little things like that that require a skill set that you typically push your high performers to work at home because they could solve that problem themselves. But the reality is over time you're going to need that skills profile. Communication skills, of course, have to be different, have to be better than working in brick and mortar. But if you've got a great communications program working in brick and mortar, you just need to add the tools and technology around it for the at-home team. Career potential. Here's an area where a lot of companies are missing the boat on is if you're hiring a resource or taking a high performer and moving them to work at home, what is their career potential after they move at home? Are they able to progress through the organization? Are they able to do other things within the company so that they can be successful, or are they stuck, quote unquote, in an at-home model and as an at-home agent? And then expand your candidate pool. You know, this is a time for everyone in the service industry to look at what their model looks like and how they can improve upon their team over time using at-home resources. And this is, you know, because you're expanding the geography in theory to what you're doing and you're not hiring necessarily local to a facility, you can really look at the best candidates in the marketplace and recruit accordingly. You know, one of the areas that's kind of often overlooked is the remote agent office, and we sometimes, smart companies have standards for what there should be, which is what we recommend. But beyond that, if you look at the criteria for where someone should be working, It's important because as we know in brick and mortar, we set up a service delivery environment. If we have, let's say we have several hundred people sitting in a call center. Well, believe it or not, that call center is designed by professionals and set up by professionals in a certain manner to not only economize, but to provide a serviceable environment for that resource to work. Sometimes companies abandon that whole concept, design, et cetera, when they have the resources working from home. They simply allow them to work from home. What you want to do is set the criteria for what their workplace is going to be. Now, it doesn't have to be institutionalized. It can be friendly. It can be warm. It can be something that's enjoyable to work in. But a resource working from home, sitting in the dark in a room with 2 monitors supporting a customer all day is probably not the most professional nor the most positive way that you want to design your at-home team and your at-home program. So workstation design and layout is important. Ergonomics are critical. We've not seen it, but there's been a bunch of small, I would say, conferences, small topics these days on ergonomics, because what's happening is the lawyers are now getting involved in understanding that over time resources working from home are going to have legal issues, problems, et cetera, that are going to have to be addressed, one of which is their workstation, how it's set up, making sure that it's comfortable for them and not a situation where they're sitting on a box for 8 hours and supporting a customer. And then the last thing is voice and privacy, and making sure that where that resource is working is private, is to where you're not going to have a lot of background noise, trains, buses, cars, people, dogs, cats, all of those things in the background as a distraction to them servicing their customers or servicing your customers. Another area that we focus on for the remote agents is agent morale. And we call them remote agent morale programs that you want to establish. One of the areas that we caution companies with is, don't think that you have to establish for your team, they have to have a separate morale program. What you want to do is enhance the morale program you have and include certain types of concepts that can get your team engaged. And a great example of this is if you've got a remote team, does that remote team as well as the brick and mortar team have a single Facebook page where they can post information, they can post things, and equate that to the in essence, the break room, right, is your virtual break room. Typically in break rooms or an idle conversation, you have your at-home agents talking about their family, what's going on, things they did last weekend. Well, there's nothing wrong with taking those same conversations and moving them to a virtual model and using a tool like Facebook to do that. Again, and if you have other tools that are very similar to that, or you have something in your organization today that allows teams to post information, and again, it can be informal, it can be more socially based, but still around your team working remotely. It's things like that that generate a positive morale for your organization and allow you to continue to keep the team connected as far as what's happening inside and outside of that brick and mortar. Touch points for the at-home agents. This is a critical area that most managers today, I think, are missing on, because most managers of support centers today are spending the same amount of time that they would in brick and mortar with those remote teams. And really the managers themselves have to redesign their time management in order to work more closely with at-home agents. Not more time, but work more closely. That means setting up separate time to speak one-on-one. That means reaching out to them with the tools and technology they have in place to ensure that those resources feel and remain connected. And this is less about communication and process, more about morale, because your at-home teams really want to believe that they're part of an organization. In order to do that, they've got to remain connected and have those touch points on a regular basis. Another area on touch points that we recommend is involving HR or your personnel department in making sure that they're reaching out to at-home agents on a regular basis. We all know in brick and mortar that you go down to the personnel department, HR, if you're having a problem with anything from benefits to problems with your supervisor, that's your avenue to go to. Well, the reality is for at-home agents, they don't have that physical location, or they may if they drive into work or something like that, but the reality is on a day-to-day basis, they don't have that access. So engaging HR to become part of that touch point program will also improve your morale. The other area is increased customer satisfaction. There is some initial data out there now, not a lot, that talks about equating customer satisfaction and its upward trend with at-home resources. And the reality is very simple. That increasing customer satisfaction is directly related to the positive attitude that your team has. And typically at-home resources have a much better attitude during the day simply because they just have a better approach to work because of that work-life balance. And again, Is there a lot of hard data on that out there today? No, we're starting to get on the front end, the fringes of positive customer experience and improvements based on at-home workers versus brick and mortar.
So, Tim, just a question on the morale piece. Are you suggesting, though, that the organization owns the morale program, or that somehow culturally the remote agents among themselves own that program?
Yeah, it goes back to the mutual responsibility discussion. Is typically in brick and mortar, the morale programs are driven from the top down. What we recommend is that in a virtual model or remote agent model, that it's not necessarily 50-50, but at least 75-25, where the organization is bringing the programs into place, but they're being driven and being worked through and worked on by the teams working remotely, so that everyone remains connected, attached, and associated with the organization.
Okay, thanks.
Stress management, I'll talk quickly about this, but the reality is it is stressful working from home. The reality is there are some stressful stressful situations simply because you're not around others. You cannot rely on leaning over to someone saying, hey, I'm having this problem, can you help me? Or I need an answer to a question about this. Your reach and extension is through the tools and technology that you put in place for your remote agents. So your team has to have the ability to remote vent and to be able to kind of go out there and say, hey, I'm having these problems, who can I talk to, and have somewhere or have a channel to go to. And that should include and should be part of the communication channels you've established. You should have virtual outings. The reality is there's no reason why you can't get everyone into the same portal to get together for a 30-minute meeting. It can be simply a meeting to find out what's going on. It can be an informal meeting, but these outings can happen. You can also have physical outings, which is something where if everyone is close to a region or an area, you can still have a centralized get-together, happy hour, whatever that may be. The reality is just because resources are virtual doesn't mean you can't physically bring them together, and they won't do it. We find that in some of our regions where we do have local events, people will drive an hour to come to that event just to see everybody and engage with them and be part of what is your culture and your environment. And then the remote agent appreciation. You do want to set up some type of program, and the resources themselves do need to understand that they are appreciated even though they're working remotely and that they're recognized. Kind of the last item we'll talk about here is communication, and we've kind of hit on it in a few different areas, but the reality is you want to provide options to your remote employee to remain connected to the organization. And we use two terms. One is forced and passive interactions and channels, communication channels. And when you think about forced, you think about phone, voice conference, video, in that those resources real time are being worked with, are being accessed, are being talked to, versus more of a passive communication channel, which is email, chat, social networking, where there's not an immediate response expected. And this is important to understand from communications perspective, because what your communications program is for your team will define how engaged they are. And so if you think about it from a broader perspective, is maybe if we're just using Skype and that's the only way the team can communicate with each other, it may not be effective enough. So you want to continuously evaluate how they're communicating. Is it effective? You may have an interaction client or something like that from a vendor or something like that. As far as how you're communicating, you can use just chat things. But just look at the broader picture of how do I ensure that my team is communicating in all mediums, voice, video, and written communications.
Tim, just on that,
can
I ask a question on the approach on communications? And maybe talk specifically to your team, is how do you optimize the communications in terms of balance? So with all these different channels, any suggestions, practical, prescriptive kind of ideas around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing is you want to define a channel that gets the remote agent access for support and service needs right away. So if they're struggling with something as far as, hey, I'm supporting a customer and there's an issue, I need some help, they have sort of a defined channel for that. You should have a channel that's for informal communications, general small talk, and just general back and forth information. And that can be any type of sort of social networking / video tool that's out there in the marketplace, but it's an informal way. And then you should have sort of that I don't want to say emergency line, but you should have that direct line that if I have a problem and I need to talk to someone, this is what I should be doing. And typically, and in most cases, that's a phone call. But you want to define that for your team so that your team clearly understands what those communication paths are for, so that they're not using them for the wrong reason and either someone becomes desensitized with them and ignores them, i.e. a chat like Skype, or that they aren't using it for the intended purposes. So what are the results? So if you have remote agents, how do you at the end of the day you say this is a success? Well, a couple of things to look at. One is, productivity gains should be no less than 10% as a goal. Turnover should be reduced by half of what you have today. So if you don't have any turnover today, obviously that would remain the same. If you've got 5% turnover, you want to cut that in half. Your replacement cost. This is an area that while we didn't talk about, it's something to think about. It is now, there's validation out there in the marketplace today that you can hire remote resources or remote agents at anywhere from 17 to 20% less than what you would pay for brick and mortar. And the reality is that in most pay scales for at-home agents, the 17 to 20% is actually made up by them in their personal income by not having to drive to an office and not having to do all the different pieces that surround a traditional brick and mortar position. And then lastly, leverage existing remote technology. So your organization has already spent, most organizations I should say, have spent a lot of money in technology that allows people to work remotely. Take advantage of what they have in place today without having to make any investments. The other area for success is the skilled labor pool, is look at the fact that the reality is you should now have an expanded labor pool to work from in order to bring on the best and most talented folks to improve the overall service model you have in place. And then lastly, at the end of the day, it should be an improved work-life balance. And this should all translate to a much happier employee and a much happier customer service experience for your customers. So if you talk about the number one, number two areas for employees today being able to work from home, most of them will say the number one is the work-life balance. Being able to, at the end of their shift, walk out of their office and be home and not have to sit and commute, et cetera. So it is a big area to say, hey, there is that work-life balance, and it is a success for our team. This is an example of actually a tool that we use called Mega Meeting. We're vendor agnostic. We use whatever the best is in the marketplace. We just happen to come across a tool that we really love. It's Mega Meeting, and this is sort of a sample screen of that. But it gives the ability for teams to be able to collaborate, communicate. We use it as in Rick's question as far as what communications channels for what. We use this for more or less informal communications across the team so that they can communicate day to day. They can talk into this. They can chat into it. They can see each other working from the standpoint of knowing, okay, this person's working today and they're available to me if I need them. So it's the little things like that that create an environment for great communications across the organization in being remote. So this sort of ends the presentation, but how Be Virtual can help, and that's part of this discussion today is really in our courses. We have two primary courses that help companies get to where they're running a service delivery organization that is remote-based at a very high level. And we have our Certified Remote Agent course, which is instructor-led virtual. That's the ILV. And then we have our Certified Remote Agent Online course, which a lot of the concepts that I just discussed over the last 30 minutes, not just all of those concepts are actually covered in detail, and then some in that course online. So really we're about creating standards. We're about creating processes within the organization so that companies can sustain remote models and do them very well over a long period of time. And Be Virtual is part of the companies that you see there, part of the BeWise group of companies. And with that, I'll turn it back to Rick. Hello, Rick. Did we lose Rick?
Got to fix the mute button there, Tim. Yeah, sorry. No, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Little delay there. Yeah, so I just want to I think those courses are also available through ThoughtRock. So if anybody is the members of ThoughtRock can also find out more information on those courses there as well. If there's any additional information, any questions you have, either specifically from Tim, more anecdotal evidence in terms of what organizations are doing. I know sometimes it's difficult to understand even where the first steps are in terms of moving to that remote agent strategy or tactic. So Tim is always available, and you can either contact him directly as well as via email through info@thoughtrock.net. We'll also make sure that any questions you have or any corresponding information you're looking for, we'll make sure that Tim gets it. So with that, I also want to make sure that we let people know next week on May the 10th, I'll just give you a few more minutes for some questions, but in doing so, I'll just let everyone know that, again, Peter Lintz is the CEO of Service Management ARC. He'll be speaking with us on the 12.5 recommendations to ensure your IT service management program succeeds. So have a look, keep an eye out for your ThoughtRock emails with additional information, as well as in the ThoughtRock emails that come out regularly, some great information, whether it's blogs, whether it's new courses that have been added to the ThoughtRock community that are all part of the membership. Always some lots of great things that are coming out on a weekly basis in ThoughtRock, so please take advantage of your membership and get in there and leverage those learning assets, and that community continues to grow.